Good afternoon and welcome to our Yuma PM-10 Non-Attainment SIP discussion. Today we'll be talking about the construction rule. My name is Heather Kraus. I'm the Deputy Assistant Director, one of two Deputy Assistants Director here in the Air Quality Division at ADEQ. And I will pass it over to Steve Burr, who's our Executive Consultant Senior.
Hi, I'm Steve Burr. I'm the planning lead for the Yuma PM-10 SIP, and I will, once we've done the preliminaries, be going over the stakeholder draft construction rule with you all. We also have Adam Ross and Lisa Tomczak. Adam is the tech lead and the overall planning, I guess the program, what am I trying to say? The project manager for the SIP, and Jackie Ronstadt just recently joined us as one of our new unit managers, and so is also working on this. And I'd like to turn it over to and of course we have Lexi, who is also working on planning of the SIP, and Lexi will be going over the GoToMeeting app and how you can participate in today's meeting.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. Perfect. So before we jump in, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the GoToMeeting buttons that we'll be using today as we move along the rule language. So you can see up at the top right, there is a little box with a question mark in it. That's where you can view chat messages, drop questions for us. We will be responding as we go. And then as you're connecting, if you have any audio connection issues, please reference the little settings button on that same panel. It should give you instructions on how to connect through your phone, which you won't be able to speak through, but you can still listen to the audio of the webinar as it's occurring. There's also a closed captions button at the bottom right of your screen if that's helpful. As far as interacting with us as we're speaking, again, you can use the question chat boxes to get your question to us. Otherwise, you can raise your hand, which if you look at the bottom left corner of your screen, there is a little hand button where it says react, and that's how you will raise your hand, and it'll pop up on the organizer side so we can click your name and ask you to unmute. We will have to ask you to unmute before you're able to unmute, but once that request goes through and you accept it, you should be able to chat. So just raise your hand when you're ready to speak, and I'll make sure you get called on. I think that's really it as far as the basics go. Also, I guess if you want to mute your mic, there's a mute button in the center of the screen, the bottom center of the screen. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Lexi. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which has the stakeholder draft construction rule. And we will be walking through that. There we go. Can everybody see that okay? Can anybody not see it okay? Let us know. Okay, thank you. So today is the first meeting to go over this rule. The plan is I will walk through it, try to highlight some of the more important elements of the rule, and perhaps explain some things that may not be all that clear. And as I walk through it, I want to encourage you all to go ahead and raise your questions. And as Lexi explained, if you raise your hand, we'll have you on mute, and we can discuss whatever concerns or questions you have about the rule. Please don't worry about interrupting the presentation. That's perfectly fine. And you can also put comments in the questions box, and we will try to get to those as quickly as we can. So today is the first of two stakeholder meetings relating to this rule. The second will be on the 20th. And at that meeting, hopefully you will have had some time to review the rule, to come up with your own additional questions, suggestions you may have for improving the rule and clarifying it. And you can submit those orally at the next stakeholder meeting, but we'll also be taking written comments on the rule. And one thing I've forgotten is, Lexi, Adam, did we set a deadline for written comments for construction and agricultural rules? Okay.
We would prefer to have feedback on the draft construction rule no later than the end of the month, 31st October. We would prefer to have feedback on the draft agricultural rule revisions no later than November 7th.
All right, thanks, Adam.
Sure.
Oh, let me go back to the rule language. So construction is one of three major sectors or types of emission sources that contribute significantly to PM10 concentrations in the Yuma PM10 nonattainment area. And so we have to include controls for that sector in our state implementation plan. The other two are passive sources of fugitive dust, primarily vacant lots or other open areas, open undeveloped areas, and roadways, and then also agriculture. We've completed the stakeholder process, at least the meetings for the stakeholder process for the open area roadways rule, and are now proceeding with the construction and the ag rule. Obviously we welcome your feedback, and we do intend to provide a written response to the comments that we received during this stakeholder process. Our plan is to fold those comments and our responses to them into the official notice of proposed rulemaking, which will be published later this year in the Arizona Administrative Register. So some of you are no doubt aware, when the state or state agency adopts a rule, they're obligated first to publish a proposal, and that proposal has to, among other things, contain an explanation of the rule, what it's for, where the legal authority comes from, the technical bases for the rules, all of that. And as part of that, we intend to incorporate a discussion of the feedback that we've gotten from stakeholders and how we are responding to it in the officially proposed rule. So before I dive into the rule language, does anybody have any questions about the process? Okay, I don't see any, so we'll move ahead. So as I hope you're aware, we published a draft of the construction rule on our website last week, and that's what's up on the screen. So this is going to be a new rule, 18.2 E 1303. The E stands for control requirements or regulations that are specific to the Yuma PM10 area, and this rule specifically is for the construction industry. It's based largely on examples that we obtained from other jurisdictions that have PM10 areas with construction as a substantial contributor to PM10 concentrations. In particular, we drew a lot from the construction rule for the Maricopa County PM-10 Nonattainment Area and the rules adopted by the Maricopa County Air Quality Department. So if any of you have operations in Maricopa County, then you're probably already familiar with the type of program that we are proposing here. One thing I wanted to point out about the draft rule is that if you see text that is italicized, that means that you can find the definition, that means that that's a defined term, and you can find the definition in the accompanying document for this rule, which is the definitions for both the construction and open area rules. We combine those since there's a lot of overlap between the two. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that text in blue is a reference to, anytime you see text in blue, it's a reference to another subsection of the rule. And in the PDF version of the document, it's also a link. So for example, if there's a reference to subsection H here, you can click on that and go immediately to subsection H. And then if you have these, back and forth arrows like you would have in a browser, you can do that with a PDF too. Then you can go back to where you were before. So it makes it a little easier to navigate around the document. All right, so let's start with subsection A, which is applicability, which is basically an explanation of what type of operations this rule is going to apply to. So this rule applies to any dust generating operations that disturb a total surface area. So it's not this threshold, and then we'll see there's a 5-acre threshold. They don't apply to the entire construction site. They apply only to the areas that are being disturbed or have been disturbed through construction activity. And so if you have disturbed surface areas at your construction site that are more than 1 acre in size, then you are going to be subject to this rule. And dust generating operations is a defined term that's probably worth taking a quick look at. It's here in the rule. And so it's defined to include earth moving, land clearing, land leveling, kind of your normal preparation work at a construction site, but also weed abatement, construction itself, demolition, bulk material handling, storage, operation of motorized machinery or vehicles or heavy equipment, establishing or using unpaved traffic areas and access routes or haul roads through the construction site, disturbed surface areas that are associated with the construction site, and installing landscapes, but only if you're using mechanized equipment. So those are the types of activities that the rule will apply to. If you can look over at the kind of table of contents here over at the side, you'll see that there are visible emissions requirements that we'll be going over, control requirements that establish specific measures that you're supposed to take with regard to dust generating operations at a construction site, requirements for track out, spillage, and erosion, signage. There are some requirements related to high pollution advisories. There are special measures that you have to take in the event that ADEQ issues one of those advisories. And then we are also proposing to require that construction sites that are subject to the rule obtain authority to operate under a general permit that will be issued by the ADEQ permit unit, the permit unit in the air quality division. Our intent is to try to get that general permit issued before the rule goes into effect so that anyone who becomes subject to the rule will be able to come in right away and get a general permit and clarify exactly what their obligations are under the rule. As we'll see a little later, if that doesn't happen, then you don't have the requirement to get, obviously, the authority to operate. That only kicks in once we actually go ahead and issue the general permit. But in the meantime, you would still be subject to the general like visible emissions control requirements and track out requirements of the rule. And then, as mentioned here, part of the obligation when you apply for your authority to operate under the construction general permit, and again, this is something that will only kick in once a general permit is actually issued, will be to submit a dust control plan, a plan that describes how you're going to go about complying with the various requirements of the rules. So that's applicability, and then we have some exemptions from the rule. So first of all, farm activities are covered by a different rule. As I mentioned earlier, we're developing and are going to have stakeholder meetings for the agricultural sector. And that is in existing rule 18.2.613.01, which we are in the process of developing amendments for. Emergency activities conducted by a utility or government agency in order to prevent public injury or restore critical utilities are exempt. Rooftop operations for cutting, drilling, grinding, or coring roofing tile, that's an exemption we just took over from the Maricopa County rule. And then one particularly important exemption is that, at least initially, this rule will not apply to any public road extension. So if you're a contractor for a local government or for ADEQ and you're building a public road, this rule initially will not apply to you. However, if the SIP that DEQ develops and submits to EPA fails to achieve the end goal, which is to bring about compliance with the PM-10 National Ambient Air Quality Standard in the Yuma area, then under the Clean Air Act, we have to have contingency measures that go into effect automatically and achieve additional reductions in emissions in order to at least partially address that failure. One of the contingency measures that we are proposing is that, and if we fail to attain the NAAQS by the deadline, which is the end of 2027, public road construction will then become subject to this rule. We'll see that later on. So now we'll get into the actual requirements of the rule. The first set of requirements relate to visible emissions or opacity. So this is a regulation basically of the extent to which any emissions that you're producing at a construction site are entrained in the air and become visible. And one way of regulating that type of emission source, a fugitive dust source, is to try to restrict the visibility or opacity of emissions. And in order to provide flexibility, we've established two alternative standards. One of those is that visible emissions cannot exceed 20% opacity, and that's wherever they're located. And then the other is that the emissions cannot extend beyond the property line. So if you comply with either of those under our proposal, you'll be in compliance with the visible emissions limitation. If you have emissions that are both over 20% opacity and extend beyond the property line, then that would constitute a violation. So I know something that's come up in the past is the burden of having a Method 9 observer, somebody trained to do Method 9 observations, because that for those of you that are not aware, there's an official EPA method for determining opacity, which is called Method 9, and it requires, among other things, that to be a qualified or official Method 9 observation, you have to have somebody who is specifically trained to perform those observations. So in looking at the Maricopa County rule, I recently noticed that the Maricopa County rule doesn't actually require you to have a Method 9 observation or to conduct Method 9 observations at your own site. This is something that instead would be performed by an ADEQ inspector. You do have other monitoring obligations that we'll get into in a little while, but I don't believe this rule would require sources to have their own observers trained in Method 9. That being said, it wouldn't be a bad idea if you can manage it to have such an observer around in order to make sure that you are in ongoing compliance with the rule, so that if you get a complaint or an inspector shows up, you won't run into any problems. You'll be aware of problems before they arise. And of course, it will also be a good idea for you to keep an eye on visible emissions generally, and be aware that that is something that you need to try to minimize at your site in order to keep in compliance with rules. So we have two exemptions from the visible emissions limitations. One is that if wind conditions are causing fugitive dust to exceed one of these visible emission limitations, then you can obtain an exemption if you meet a number of conditions, the most important being that you cease the dust generating operations while the visible emissions are occurring. So while you have this dust event, and there's no particular threshold for the wind, it just has to be wind that is sufficient to overpower your the control measures that you have in place. And if that's happening, then and you meet the other conditions and cease your operations while that's going on, then you would be able to demonstrate that you are not in violation of the visible emissions requirement. And the other limit is for emergency maintenance of flood control channels and water retention basins. So those are the visible emissions limits. Do we have any? I think we have a question. Let's see. And let's see. Oh, we already answered that. Okay.
If you have anything to add, please feel free to do so.
Sure. No, that is all correct. ADEQ would issue the construction general permit. And just for a little more background, the way general permits work is that I guess you're probably already aware of this because most of you are probably subject to the stormwater permit program, but the department issues a permit that covers everybody, that has conditions that are appropriate for all of the types of operations that are embraced by the general permit. And then your obligation it's that permit that goes through public notice and comment. And then you're able to obtain an authority to operate under that permit without actually getting your own individual permit. So so it would work the same way as it does with stormwater, but it would be separate from the stormwater permits, as Adam said.
That's what we're doing. Raise my hand.
Also, Steve, sorry, I just asked to unmute David Sharp. He had raised his hand, but it looked like it got lowered. So David, if you still have a question, feel free, you should be unmuted now.
This is Harold and David. The question on the opacity rule, is that in effect only when activities are happening on the developed ground or the ground being developed, or is that 365?
365.
Ooh,
Ouch.
ooh.
Yeah, so similar to the open area rule, there's an obligation to make sure that you keep your construction area stabilized. So while you're not out there working, you should have taken measures necessary to ensure that the areas that you've been working on are stabilized and not producing fugitive dust emissions.
So what you just told us is we're going to have someone on site 365 days a year conducting an opacity test. That's what you just told us.
That is not at all what I just told you. You're not under any obligation to be out there observing opacity. You just have to take measures ahead of time to suppress emissions. So, for example, if you've got a large disturbed area, you can have a soil crust. You can it may not be appropriate for a lot of construction sites, but you can have standing or flat vegetation. You can show that your threshold friction velocity is below a certain level. But generally, you just need to stabilize the area, and having a stabilized area does not require you to always be at the area, let alone to have an opacity observer there, because as I explained earlier, that's not your obligation either. There's nothing in the rule that requires you to make opacity observations, but you will be held responsible if an inspector shows up and you haven't adequately stabilized the area, and that results in visible emissions exceeding the standard.
I might just add a couple of things that might help get at the concern. Section N of this draft, which we'll get to at the very end, because that's where it is, discusses the monitoring requirements that exist. And as Steve described, there is not such a requirement for opacity observations. And then also, as far as whether the opacity requirements themselves apply at all times, as you can see in the middle of the screen here, there are circumstances under which the operation is exempt from those opacity requirements, provided all of the conditions that we're about to meet. And Steve highlighted preventing undue wind erosion by stabilizing surfaces in advance, which is at the heart of that exemption. Under those circumstances, the opacity limits would not apply.
Right.
Does that answer the question, Harold or David?
It helps, Adam, but it's, still trying to think how that happens practically, I mean, if you're in construction, you're stabilizing the ground, and end the day on Friday, you stabilize the lot, and you leave coming back on Monday, and it's 110 degrees in Yuma. You can't wait till Monday to come back to restabilize it, because it'll be dried out and blowing dead potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have to, that's the cost that the construction guys will have to bear. They're going to have to water every single day on their site, 365.
So it would depend on the surface material, right? Under certain circumstances, provided you've watered sufficiently, you might, when that surface dries out, have a soil crust that is relatively resistant to wind erosion. But depending on what we're talking about, there's a lot of loose material that's not going to form a crust. Yes, that is possible, in which case that is the intention. I mean, the point is to prevent windblown dust from being generated where possible.
Yeah, the challenge for the construction guys is they don't have the organic matter in the soil that the ag guys do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the challenge. So we look at soil differently, guys.
Yeah.
Sorry, when I say soil, I just mean surface material in this case. whatever that may happen to be.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
We can go on, but that was a question we had right there.
If y'all have any remaining concerns about the way the opacity requirement is presented, once we reach the end of the rule, please do follow up.
Okay, all right, so those are the visible emissions requirements. We'll move now into the control requirements. And so this is pretty much
Steve,
consistent.
Sorry to interrupt, but before we get into that, it looks like we have a question from George.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I missed that.
You should be able to unmute now, George.
My question is going back to the wind conditions. There is no threshold. However, there is still an expectation to have the site stabilized, even when there is no work being performed. How could you hold someone accountable if there is emissions from the site?
So if you have wind conditions that are causing fugitive dust to exceed the visible limits, and you've employed the control measures, and in particular, you know, if you have an approved dust control plan and you employ the measures that are in that approved dust control plan, but even in the absence of a plan, like say this is before we issue a general permit, you have control measures that follow these control requirements that meet the requirements of the rule, then you would have an exemption from the visible emissions limit. So if you've done all you can, if you otherwise follow the requirements of the rule, and as a result of when you nevertheless have visible emissions that cross your property line and exceed 20% opacity, then you would be exempt from the requirement.
And with that, I mean, there are some sections here that just have wind conditions, and then others high wind conditions. Is there a difference between them?
Yeah, we discussed. So there are requirements that go to effect if we have a Yuma PM-10 high pollution advisory forecast. So the distinction here is if we have a high pollution advisory forecast, which are in the Yuma area going to be because of high winds, then we want special requirements to go into effect. So this is a statement of what you have to do if there are very high wind conditions. So it's an additional set of requirements. The exemption is for your benefit. So if there are wind conditions, they don't necessarily have to be conditions that would result in a high pollution advisory. But you have wind conditions that are causing visible emissions that are not avoidable. And you can show that you have stabilized the surface areas at your site, taken the measures that would normally result in stabilization at your site, and meet the other requirements of the exemption, then you don't have a violation.
Okay. So as long as you can yeah.
If that's, take a look at that though, because that's something that we're kind of wrestling with. And if you think it's not clear or you have suggestions for it, that's an area that we want to hear your comments on anything, but that I think is something that we would appreciate, particularly appreciate input on.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm sorry, real quick before we move on, I forgot earlier to ask folks to introduce themselves. If you're going to pose a verbal question or provide verbal feedback, just in case, for example, someone wants to refer back to your question or comment later to make it easier for them. So that was George Maya from Yuma County DTS, We previously heard from Harold Maxwell and David Sharp from Yuma County Farm Bureau. Thanks.
All right, so getting into the control requirements in D. So one is just a general requirement that you use the applicable controls as we just discussed. Not that you have to apply water on the weekend, but that you have applied water so that it's effective during weekend, after hours, and on holidays. In other words, you're obligated to try to keep your site stabilized. And you have to implement at least one control measure for each dust generating operation. And again, this may be a little redundant, we'll have to look at it, but again, all controls that are necessary to maintain stabilized soil shall be implemented 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't know, in light of Harold's comment, I think maybe we can take a look at whether implemented is the right word here. Maybe there's a better word that conveys the sense that it has to have been implemented, and effective doesn't mean that you have to be out there applying water, obviously, or at least that was never the intent, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then here's another requirement that in the event of high wind conditions that are causing visible emissions to exceed limits in subsection C, you're obligated to cease your operations unless stabilization can prevent such excess emissions. We're going to have, so we'll need to take a look at that one, because I think that may be somewhat redundant with the exemption above. And as George, I think, pointed out earlier, here we have high wind conditions, and the other one we just have wind conditions. And I think this is a little confusing now that I look at it again. So that's the general requirement. Then we have requirements for specific types of activities. So for unpaved traffic areas, and we can maybe look at the definition for that. That's basically any area where you're parking or staging equipment, but let's look at the definition. So it's any unpaved non-road area that's used with the consent of the property owner for parking, maneuvering, material handling, storing motor vehicles and equipment. So it's the same definition, because these are the same definitions as for the open area rule, if you're already familiar with that. So for those areas, there's a requirement to not allow silt loading to exceed a certain amount, 0.33 ounces per square foot. And then if it is greater than 33 ounces per square foot, then you're still not in violation as long as the silt content doesn't exceed 8%. And let's see. And then there are obligations here to stabilize the surface of an unpaved parking area. And then essentially the same requirements apply to unpaved haul and access roads. The only difference being that you're not, if you exceed the 0.33 ounces per square foot for silt loading, then the silt content can't exceed 6% rather than 8%. And that is something that we just took from the Maricopa County rule. I don't know, Adam, is there a good technical explanation for that?
It made sense at the time. I don't recall off the top of my head
Right.
what the distinction was. But I can look into that if folks have specific questions about it and get back to them. Before we move on to inactive disturbed surfaces, there's a question from Randall Christ. Randy, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thank you, guys. Randall Chris with the City of Yuma building official. I had a question. I don't know if we're going to get to it or not, but we have a lot of subdivisions that, residential subdivisions and commercial that are built out with the roadways. Of course, I guess under construction, this would apply, but once the construction is done and the permits are starting to be issued by each individual home, does the dust control requirements pertain to all the vacant lots that haven't been developed yet, spread out through that new subdivision?
Either this rule will apply because one way or another, you would definitely have to keep those vacant lots stabilized. And under the circumstances you described, I'm not entirely certain whether you would apply this rule because there's ongoing construction within the subdivision. I think we have to look at whether the subdivision is a single construction site. And if it is, then this next rule that we're going to look at, inactive disturbed surface areas, would apply to those vacant lots, and they would have to be maintained in a stabilized condition. If the lots are not within a single construction site, like there's another owner for those lots, for example, and so they're not under active construction, they're awaiting construction activities at some point in the future, then the open area rule would apply, but the requirements would be essentially the same. I mean, the fundamental obligation is to maintain these disturbed surface areas, or to restabilize these disturbed surface areas and make sure that they don't, or try to ensure that they don't become a source of windblown fugitive dust. Adam, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just had one more tag on to that. So I've attended most of your workshops discussing this matter, and I can't recall what the decision was made. Is sand considered fugitive dust, or is it based on the particulate size? I don't remember, but in the eastern part of the Yuma County, sand is everywhere, blowing around off these lots, off of the desert. I don't recall if moving sand is fugitive dust.
It depends on the context, so it depends on where you see the phrase fugitive dust. In the case of this draft rule, for example, blowing sand would contribute towards the opacity limits, for example. Sand does block light, so if you have blowing sand in excess of 20% opacity, that would violate the opacity limit. However, I think you're specifically referring to the open areas rule that we had discussed on previous workshops. And in that case, the way that the draft rule is currently written, it doesn't make that distinction based on what type of surface material is present on a particular open area, but we think we have a good way to address that. And the intention would be for that open area rule not to require that sandy surfaces be stabilized. In particular, if there is so little silt in surface material that it would be practically impossible, for instance, to stabilize it via watering. It's not going to form a crust. It's, like loose sand. We're working on language to adjust that draft open areas rule to provide an exception for sandy surfaces like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, no other questions? All right, so the next control requirement applies to, and it's basically what we were just talking about, inactive disturbed surface areas. So these are disturbed surface areas at a construction site where no activity is occurring. So you could have a subdivision that is being developed by a single owner operator that has some lots in active construction, other lots vacant, and I believe this rule would apply to those lots, but the requirements are essentially the same as for an open area. First of all, the visible emission requirements are the same as in the open area rule, and then the stabilization requirements are the same. So again, it's maintain a soil crust, maintain a low threshold friction velocity, maintain flat or vegetative cover, actually there's three different, let's see. Oh, and maintain a cover that is equal to or greater than 10% for non-erodible evidence elements. And I think this is, or is a mistake here, but we'll check that. And then there's also an obligation to erect signs and install physical barriers to limit trespass for those areas to ensure that you don't have third parties trespassing on these vacant lots and disturbing the areas that you've taken such pains to stabilize. So that's inactive disturbed surface areas. If you have an active disturbed surface area, so this is kind of the catch-all rule for all the types of activities that you might engage in at a construction site, like earth moving and so forth. So where you have actual construction activities going on that is disturbing the surface area in an ongoing manner. First of all, you have to have a wind barrier that is 3 feet or more in height. Again, you have to limit vehicle traffic. Was there a question? Oh, George.
Yeah. If I might, this is David Sharp, and referring to all these vacant lots, items 1 through 5 all require water and a lot of water. And we are in a drought situation, and that's tough. But also, you may have where you say you got to keep a vegetative cover. You might be in some kind of a HOA or similar thing that says keep your weeds under control. So if you can't keep a vegetative cover, how do you keep this all under control?
Well, vegetative cover is, you don't have to have a vegetative cover. You can use one of the other options, I guess would be my answer to that. It's the vegetative cover elements, they are options. None of the, you're not required to do all of these, you're required to do one of them.
Well, I get that, but I'm looking through this and say, number one, that takes a lot of water to do all of these things. And number two, if you don't have the water, what's your alternative? And I'm not sure that these are really doable with these regulations. You take the guy that buys a lot for development and investment, he's got to figure out how to do all this. I get it while the contractor's actually developing the lots and laying it out, but once the developer is laid it out and it's gone and other people own it, if it all comes down to the landowner, these are pretty strict requirements for them.
So as Steve was
especially if they're
describing,
under some kind of an HOA or a guideline of some kind.
as Steve was describing earlier, this would be the applicable requirement if the site in question were still operating under a construction general permit. If the project in question had ended and there's not, any particular time constrained planned construction for this site, it's just sitting there vacant. There's no construction project to speak of impacting it. Then, provided that the permit has been closed, this would these requirements would give way to the open area requirements from the draft rule that we went over last month.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clearing that up.
But regarding which of these options might be low water options, the second and last options on list 4A, which as Steve was describing, this is an either or list. You don't have to do all these things. Pick the one that makes the most sense for your site. Option number 2 and option number 6 refer to the composition of the surface material in terms of, for instance, things like aggregate or other structural amendments that could change the erodibility of the surface as a whole. We don't currently have an option to just cover it with something like straw or similar. But there are a couple of options on there that don't explicitly require watering. Whether those would be viable for every area, not necessarily. But if there are other things that folks do to prevent undue blowing dust on open areas that are, let's say, awaiting the next phase of construction, we would like to hear about it, so that if they are appropriately effective, we can add them as options to the list. Again, preferably by the end of the month. And then George had a question or comment as well.
Yes, thank you, George Amaya, Human County Development Services. Steve, could you expand on 5A, on what it means by non-linear project?
I'm sorry, where was that again?
5A?
Oh, 5A?
Yes. For each non-linear project, can you expand what you mean by non-linear project?
That may be an artifact of the Maricopa County language, because we don't have any like alternate applicability thresholds for a linear project like
Yeah,
a trench
I think that's
road.
what that is.
do we? Yeah. So that's just an artifact. You can disregard that.
And then within this section, so there is a requirement to perform under number 5, A through C, and a wind barrier.
Yes.
So assuming you have 10 acres, there would be a wind barrier requirement on the perimeter. How effective has this been within Maricopa County?
We don't know that at this point, but we can look into it. You're thinking that is likely not to be a very effective measure, I take it, George?
Well, just questioning the effectiveness of this barrier. I mean, from a construction standpoint, I can only imagine the cost of having during construction, a perimeter barrier
Right.
for X amount of acreage.
Mm-hmm.
Is perimeter wind fencing not commonplace in Yuma presently?
It is, but I mean, if I apples and oranges with the stormwater program, there are still fencing requirements. However, there are waivers as well within the stormwater program that essentially, if there is no runoff activity that would reach an MS4 or a water of the U.S. state waters, then the silt fence is not really required for the acreage.
See.
So for a project like the one that you're describing, what's the current state? What would the perimeter fencing for a project like that look like now, typically?
Well, again, we don't currently have a SIP. So from an air quality standpoint, I don't know, the effectiveness of a barrier during construction. Now, the subdivisions at build out can have or will have a barrier. It could be a solid wall, but during construction, I just don't know how effective that would be.
I'm sorry, that wasn't very clear. My question wasn't about effectiveness. I apologize. It was just about what is currently in use in Yuma for the type of project that you were describing, where an erosion barrier at the perimeter of a project may not be necessary.
If applicable within the stormwater program, silt fencing as an example. But then again, like I said, there are within the permitting, there are waivers for that program. No discharge certificate, for example. So not all projects will require silt fencing as a BMP.
Right. So for projects like those, what kinds of barriers, if any, do they have surrounding the construction site? Just chain link fencing with nothing on it?
Yeah, there is no, from my experience, chain link fencing on a proposed subdivision on the perimeter. And I don't know if anybody within the construction can speak to that, but yeah, that's not a common practice for a site, 5, 10, or whatever the acreage may be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would be helpful to hear about if folks have feasibility perspectives on that.
This is Randy with the city. Could you guys hear me?
Go ahead, Randy.
Randy with the city of Yuma. Most of the, George is correct on the subdivisions. They'll start, grading practices, 10 or more acres of subdivision. In a lot of cases in the Yuma area, they don't have any fencing at all, not even chain link, because it would be in the way of the excavation, that kind of thing. I mean, they are watering, but there isn't a barrier. Then on smaller construction sites, commercial in particular, if they have, as George mentioned, the waiver for the silt fence, most of them are just having a temporary chain link construction fence around. Sometimes they'll put some screening but that's more of a privacy thing that they're trying to accomplish. I don't believe it I don't know what 50% porosity or less, what that is, if that's a silt fence type density or what that means.
Typically, just as a laugh test, if you can't see through it, it's probably got less than 50% porosity.
Okay.
Substantially less.
I would say
there ever be like,
that.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say 90% of the construction sites that I'm seeing in the city and even in the county probably would achieve that. Yeah, it seems very difficult. I mean, the subdivisions do get block walls, but they're generally completed or nearing completion.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that situation you described in which even fencing would interfere with excavation, you're talking about even perimeter fencing around the entire subdivision.
Well, yeah, because the lots are built up right to the proper, yes, that would interfere even on a perimeter fence in most cases, yes.
I think we did.
I know I know we talked about this in the workshops, and I raised, I think George raised, I think a lot of contractors raised a red flag on this particular requirement. This one's tough for in the construction community to achieve this. If I'm talking out of turn or incorrectly, George, correct me, but that's what I think we all agreed upon back then.
Randy, yeah, this is George. May I second that? This, we asked construction, just to go back to some of the other requirements within stormwater, just the applicability and costs and the silt fencing during for that construction, and it was not reasonable if it's not applicable within that program. So here we are on air quality, and you just have to question whether or not this is truly effective.
I'm not sure we could easily find a whole lot of information about its effectiveness in a timely fashion, but we can see what we can find. More actionable, I think, if this really is an operational feasibility issue, not just related to cost, but if it actually gets in the way of critical operations, that's not going to be specific to Yuma. Whatever area we borrowed this from, we can see what they do about that operational feasibility concern. David, you still have a hand up. Did you have something else to add?
The question was asked how effective this was in Maricopa. So the question is, how much of all this language is from Maricopa? And is that really relevant to Yuma? Because we don't have the same situation that Maricopa has.
Well, in what sense is it? I mean, it's pretty similar. They're dry, desert areas with a lot of windblown dust and a lot of construction activity.
But their non-attainment area is much more serious than ours.
So in theory, if it's the same, then if we're a lesser degree, then we ought to be able to strike something like this out of the plan, because this would be something that would be needed for a serious non-attainment area, just not a non-attainment area. So you're looking for things to make it work, that would do it. And then it also gives you a step-up value if we ever move, which I don't think we will, to a serious non-attainment area.
So your concern is that perhaps Maricopa County added this requirement because they were scraping the bottom of the barrel effectiveness-wise to get whatever they could for serious attainment or serious non-attainment.
There's serious non-attainment versus just a non-attainment, correct? I mean, the whole process is supposed to be tailored for an area, and we shouldn't be doing what Maricopa County is doing necessarily, because why should we be held to a serious non-attainment area when we're only a non-attainment area?
So just to provide some context for those who aren't familiar with the planning background of either Yuma or the Phoenix PM-10 Nonattainment Area, the Yuma PM-10 Nonattainment Area is classified as moderate non-attainment for the PM-10 standard, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for 24-hour average PM10 concentrations. Whereas if the area were to fail to meet the obligations set out by EPA to attain that standard, one consequence would be that it would be bumped up to reclassified to what we call serious non-attainment of the standard, which has happened in the Phoenix area, and which in general, we don't need to go into all the details, but in general calls for more stringent controls and or more broadly applicable controls. What we've done here for this particular draft rule, using certain portions of Maricopa County's construction dust rule as a framework. The primary adjustments that we've made to account for Yuma's moderate non-attainment status are in terms of applicability rather than stringency of individual requirements. At least the portions of the rule that I'm aware of. I don't know. Are there, Steve or Lexi or Lisa, does anyone recall any Maricopa County requirements that we just wholesale removed?
There are requirements that we left out for storage piles and bulk handling, for freeboard, for materials that are being hauled into and out of a construction site. I think they have also freeboard and covering requirements for, the transport of materials. So yeah, we don't, essentially what we were trying to do is develop a rule that would be consistent with the assumptions made in the modeling demonstration, because that's something required for either a moderate or a serious area, is that you have to model attainment by the deadline. If we can't model attainment by the moderate deadline, then you'll be serious for sure. That's going to happen. So we're trying to model attainment and actually achieve attainment by the moderate deadline. And so, but we can take another look at whether this specific requirement is really necessary for the attainment demonstration. We can look at, as Adam was indicating, both the operational feasibility and the economics of it. So I think that's all we can really say at this point. We can't commit to take it out or anything, but we can definitely, since this is of significant concern, I think it merits another look on our part.
As I mentioned earlier, we can see what we can find about the effectiveness of this particular provision, either in Maricopa County or anywhere else where something similar has been required. But we won't have time, for example, to do any studies from scratch in the field in order to meet our planning timeline for the Yuma area. So if folks are aware of any literature or any maybe even just anecdotal experience that you have, particularly in the Yuma area, with wind barriers, or in particular with things like wind screening being ineffective when it comes especially to large construction sites, please share that information with us. But we'll see what we can find. And if nothing else, we can, as I mentioned earlier, examine what other areas have done to address the operational feasibility issue that y'all described. And then Kirk also raised a hand. If you're still with us, Kirk, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, no, I was just following up on Randy and George's comments regarding the barriers, and I put something in the questions comments. Typically we've used those wind barrier type fencing situations more as a privacy screen than my experience is, when we do have a wind event, they do very little because they're not buried, for one, typically like you would with a silt fence of something that size. And so it works its way underneath the fence and also over the top of the fence. So, and most of the time they end up on the ground because the wind catching that thing, it's like a flag in the wind. It'll snap every piece of tie or they rip. So they don't hold up very long. Obviously, long-term solution, is the CMU perimeter walls, but those are typically, like Randy and George said, they're not typically installed till towards the end of the project. My experience, they look pretty, those barrier fences, but they in actuality of functionality, they don't work as well, especially on a large site. You know, on a small site, you know, a couple acres, maybe 3 acres, it'd probably be all right. But if you have 20 acres opened up, it's too big of an area. I mean, they don't, they do, there's very little that they do to help.
And then, thank you for sharing that part. One last item for the group's benefit. Kelsey McCumber pulled up the applicable section of Maricopa County's construction rule, which appears to list fencing as an option in the case of active disturbed areas, rather than a requirement in its own right, but an option to fulfill the requirement. So we'll double check that. Thank you very much. I still see 2 hands up.
Those are the same 2, aren't they?
David and Kirk, yes. Did you have anything else to add?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
And Farm Bureau? I'm not hearing anything from the Farm Bureau. But
We have Michael Barton. Yeah.
Thanks. Mike Barton with Hydrogeochem, and we have a client in Yuma, and that client, they're operating under an individual air permit, but which does include requirements for particulate matter and opacity and such, and dust control. I'm wondering, how is this rule going to interact with the requirements of an individual permit? Would we also have to get, because the activities, certainly would fall under construction, would we also have to get the construction general permit?
Well, can I ask what is the individual, what type of operation?
So it's a landfill.
A landfill, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So you're saying that, yeah, they have like ongoing construction activities.
Yeah, it's ongoing all the time.
Obviously, like, yeah, excavation.
It certainly overlaps.
No, that's a good point. I think maybe.
are we talking about construction like the routine earth moving activities to open a new cell? Or are we talking about something not covered under the air permit as written? Like
well, I think it is covered under the air permit as written, but yeah, it would, I guess my main concern would be, yes, constructing a new cell and earth moving involved with that, but also just ongoing operations in a landfill. You're moving materials all the time.
Right. Yeah.
And
to the extent that those operations, oh, I'm sorry, please go ahead.
No, it's just that, we do have dust control controls in place and in operation on a continuing basis. I think they probably would satisfy any of the requirements here, but I guess, I'm just looking at the interaction of the different permits and such.
Steve, Lexi, Lisa, anyone else from ADEQ, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the intention is that any dust generating operations that are covered under an existing permit, whether that's an existing ADEQ air permit, whether that's an individual permit or some other general permit, for example, for a crushing and screening operation.
Right. I mean, I think we cover a lot of activities that include earth moving, mining, rock crushing, rock quarrying. So, and the intention obviously wasn't our intention to cover those with the construction general permit, and I think that would be the case for the landfill
Okay.
as well. So that's something we'll need to make, you know, you pointed out a good issue. I think it's something we need to make clearer in the rule.
Yeah, it's more a matter of clarification, I think, more than anything else. Yeah.
Right. Because we do say, you know, these apply at a construction site, so it's during construction. But let's see, in construction is defined as, I mean, arguably under the definitional writ, like, you know, I'm not sure a landfill qualifies as building, maintaining, or modifying a capital improvement resting upon or connected to or buried in the earth.
No, I thought it was further down under earth moving activities.
Well, but still it has to be at a construction site. The earth moving activities have to be at a construction site.
Okay.
But that's not to say, and Sean, I guess, is agreeing, but not to say we couldn't make it clearer. I think we can take a look at whether it would make sense to add an exemption for operations that are covered by an individual permit because they belong to some industry.
I might also be concerned about how this applies to, for a new permit, for example, where a source is not yet operating but is in the construction phase. We want to make sure it's unambiguous what our intentions are in that circumstance. So we'll probably need to talk to our permit folks about that and see what would make the most sense.
Okay. That helps. Thank you.
All right. So it looks like we're current with questions. So there, just really quickly, there are, you know, a number of other specific activities that have their own control measures: demolition, weed abatement, cut and fill, and trenching. And then any questions or comments on those? Okay. And then this is a very common element of construction rules. Also, some other rules, or we also have requirements like this for example, rock quarrying. You know, basically controlling track out and spillage and erosion onto public areas, in particular public roads, from trucks entering or exiting a construction site is a very important element of the program. And in this rule, we require both track out prevention, which means having some sort of device, whether it's a gravel pad or grizzly or pavement, that will result in the potential track out material being shaken off the truck before it exits the site, or it can be washed off the truck with a wheel wash system. And then when track out does occur, there's an obligation to clean it up and ensure that it doesn't, it's not subject to re-entrainment from additional traffic over the area. Any questions or comments on track out?
We have a question from Manny at San Luis asking if we could go over street sweeping requirements. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Manny, or if you're talking about the routine street sweeping requirements for public road operators. In the latter case, those are addressed not in this draft rule, but in the open area and road dust draft rule that we went over last month. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that one and would like to do so, you can find it at azdeq.gov/Yuma-PM-10 nonattainment area, where you can also find drafts of this rule and everything else that we're going over. But if you have other questions about the sweeping or other track out cleanup requirements for construction site operators, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand to clarify, we can address those questions now. Okay, Manny says thank you, so I think we can move on. Thanks.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, we have a signage requirement so that the public is aware of the dust control requirements that apply to construction sites. This, I think, was taken directly from the Maricopa County rules, but I think it's fairly straightforward. Do we have any initial comments or questions about this requirement?
It looks like George has his hand up.
Yeah, George.
Thank you. Sorry, Steve, going back to the street sweeping for construction, now is the operator or owner to demonstrate that they have a certified PM-10 street sweeper as well? For this control measure?
No, they don't. And in fact, for track out, any effective means of cleanup is fine. They don't have to use a street sweeper at all, let alone a PM-10 certified street sweeper. So these again are all options for cleaning up track out after it occurs. One of which is to operate a street sweeper.
Great, thank you.
Sure. All right, so moving on to the Yuma PM-10 high pollution advisory forecast. So ADEQ periodically puts out these forecasts for many of our non-attainment areas when our assessment team forecasts that there could be pollution exceeding one of the NACs, and they do this now for the Yuma PM-10 non-attainment area. And so this is a requirement that specifically applies when such a forecast has been issued. In that event, the owner or operator is required to complete a site-wide inspection and to verify and keep records showing that they've done this, that all applicable control measures in the dust control plan are implemented and disturbed surface areas are stabilized, or that all dust generating operations have ceased. So that would eliminate the requirement to follow the specific control requirements for specific types of activities. But again, that all disturbed surface areas are stabilized. So it's basically a requirement that if we're in a situation where it's probable that a PM-10 violation is going to occur, that operators of construction site go out and make sure that they've done everything they're supposed to do in advance of the day of the forecast to ensure that to try to mitigate emissions of PM-10 from their site. And then, as discussed earlier, we do intend to issue a general permit for construction in the Yuma area, just as Maricopa County Air Quality Department and also now the Pinal County Air Quality District do for construction in their non-attainment areas. And when we've done so, each construction site will be required to get an authority to operate. Under those permits, they'll have to maintain copies of the permits on site. And we propose that when we get an application for coverage under the construction general permit or for authority to operate, we'll act on that within 14 calendar days. We're trying to, stay on a expeditious schedule for this because we don't want to unduly delay any projects. If the authority to operate will last for a year, and if you've got a project that's going to go on for more than a year, then you would be obligated to come in and renew it 14 days before the authority to operate expires. And then there's also an obligation to keep a copy of the permit posted at the construction site. The construction permit application will have to include a dust control plan that provides basic information about the owner or operator, the location of the site, the nature of the project, and then identify the specific control measures that the operator intends to implement at the site. And then, of course, you'll be under an obligation to follow that plan once it's been approved by EPA. We also have a requirement for proposing requirements for 2 types of dust control training classes that would be made available by ADEQ. The first one would be a basic dust control training class for water truck drivers, water pull drivers, and one person, the site superintendent or other person who is basically responsible for overall operation of the site. If you have a larger site, then you'll need to have, which is a site with more than 5 acres of disturbed surface area, you would be obligated to have a dust control coordinator whose primary responsibility would be at the site would be ensuring that dust control requirements are satisfied, and that person would have to go through a different training class, a comprehensive dust control training class. And again, there's the requirement to have the dust control coordinator. And the way the rule is drafted, once you were able to bring your disturbed surface area below 5 acres, that requirement would go away. And you could, if it's a large company, you could move your dust control coordinator to another site that needs him or her. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the rule initially does not apply to public road construction, but again, we have this contingency measure which provides that if there is a violation of the PM10 NAAQS, if there is a violation, if we fail to attain the PM10 NAAQS by the 1997 deadline, then that exemption will go away, and this rule will apply to public road construction as well as the other types of construction that are already covered. Subsection M is very similar to the compliance determination provisions of the open area rule, if you're already familiar with those, but it specifies first the methodology for determining compliance with the 20% opacity limit, another method for determining whether visible emissions are crossing the property line. We've added, because there are specific limits on silt content on unpaved parking areas or unpaved traffic areas and unpaved haul roads, we have methodology for determining silt content, and then we have these methods for determining whether a site is in compliance with one of the stabilization requirements set forth in the rule for inactive areas of a construction site. And these are all, again, the same methods as in the open area rule. We will be moving all of these. Right now, we're referencing Maricopa County Appendix C. For these methods, we'll be moving them into a state appendix 16 when we actually move forward with the official proposed rule. Finally, we have monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. And as I mentioned early on, you are obligated to conduct a self-inspection on each day that just generating operations are occurring, and record items such as crusted or damp soils and track out conditions, information about the control measures that are being employed, about street sweeping if that is occurring. Again, that may not be a requirement depending on what you're using to control or to clean up track out, maintenance of the track out control devices. If the department, you're not obligated automatically to submit any of those records to the department, but if you are requested to do so, then you are required to within 2 business days, unless the request comes from an on-site inspector, in which case you're required to provide those records on that same day. You have to notify us under the proposed rule when the construction project is terminated, no later than 30 days after termination, and you're obligated to retain the records that are required by the rule for at least 3 years. For just for reference, the holders of individual permits are obligated to retain records for 5 years, but we thought for these construction projects we could require a lower amount of time, and so we're proposing 3 years. Okay, and it looks like
we have a hand. Oh, perfect. We have a hand from Kelsey. I'm gonna unmute her right now. Ask her to unmute. Kelsey, you should be good to go.
Awesome. Hi, guys. My name is Kelsey. I'm actually an air inspector here at ADEQ. My question was regarding the dust control training. I'm familiar that this is very similar to Maricopa counties, and I'm wondering if individuals are already certified in Maricopa County, if that would apply to this requirement, or if there's going to be a separate training established.
Oh, that's a really good question. We hadn't really thought of that, but I think that's a good idea that we can probably allow people who are certified for Maricopa County, or allow certification in Maricopa County to qualify for certification under our program.
Yeah, I would imagine. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Kelsey.
I was going to say, I would imagine that would reduce the burden, because I do imagine some of these larger companies will have, operators that, maybe in September are working in Yuma, and October are working in Maricopa County, and they're going to need it in Maricopa County regardless. And being a 3-year certification, I could see that they'd just be redundant having to do both.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
We also had a question from Kirk asking, will ADEQ be offering training classes? That does sound like a worthwhile efficiency if we can figure out how to make it work. As we've noted, the requirements of this rule are not exactly the same as the requirements of Maricopa County's construction rule. So we would want to be confident that anyone we're certifying is trained, is familiar with the requirements of this rule. So we might need to do something supplementary to make sure they understand the differences, but we can look into that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Kurt. Just one quick suggestion. I don't know if you guys have thought about this, but just to kind of add on to that, have you thought about having a train the trainer? I mean, we do stuff for, our OSHA training thing, that we have certified trainers on board that can in turn train other staff to alleviate perhaps the bottleneck that you may experience trying to get a broad spectrum of people, trained across the state, specifically here in Yuma County. Just a suggestion to throw out there. I mean, it may be a more in-depth type class to offer for, a select group of people, but just Just a suggestion.
Hopefully that burden will be a non-issue. Ideally, we would offer both of these would be fairly lightweight trainings and available for virtual delivery online, but everything regarding the implementation of this draft rule is still subject to change. So if we do find ourselves in a position where that would be burdensome, we can certainly see about that suggestion. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.
All right, well,
I think I saw George's hand first.
two hands just shot up, so let's.
George McCann, could you quickly walk us through the permit application process? Will this be an application under My ADEQ online?
That's what we anticipate, yeah, is we would like to get that integrated into, like our other, the other general permits issued by our permits unit would be, it would be available through My ADEQ.
All right. And then that would be a 14-day turnaround by the department?
That is what we're shooting for, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, Paul.
We have a.
David,
That- Yep.
Go ahead.
Okay, good. We're just waiting. This is Harold. One of the things you probably don't understand about me is that my sister and I own an LLC that's dedicated to providing low-income housing for people of low income. And we do that because we want people, lower income status to have a good place to live. And so, the profit motive is not there as you would normally see in some of the other areas. That being said, as I look at this stuff, I'm torn. I see a lot of expense going in that's going to have to get passed on by construction to the end user. And so I see our ability to buy other units in the future being decreased. And in an environment where we already know we have a shortage of low-income housing, we're making the matters worse. So what I would encourage everyone to do and to think about is that, yes, we've got a baseline with Maricopa County and Pinal County, but they are not the same level we are. We are in a much better situation. And we need to look at this and determine, do we have to do all these things to get the SIP approved? Because the ultimate goal is to get the SIP approved, so then we can claim the high wind events. And we know from looking at 30 years of data that you got to have no more than three failures, high wind, failures within a 3-year window, and you can thing 25 miles an hour or higher from that calculation. And from looking at the data that we have, I understand some of it's not in the form it should have been. It appears to me that once the SIP's approved, we're going to be able to get that status, and we're going to go to an attainment status quickly. And I just don't want a bunch of expenses baked into the future that impacts the ability for us to provide affordable housing to low-income individuals. And I think we really need to think about that as we look at this whole process. And that's just my statement that I wanted to make sure got on the record.
Thank you for sharing that. I mentioned earlier, one of the adjustments we had made relative to Maricopa County's rule was with respect to applicability. In particular, the 1 acre threshold of applicability for this rule, or for this draft of the rule anyway, was selected, first of all, for simplicity, so that the rule would be easy for folks to understand in the same way, but also because a meaningful proportion of small single family home construction based on the records that we had available to us, appeared to fall under that 1 acre threshold, provided that the construction of those homes was taking place on an individual basis, as opposed to like a whole subdivision being developed at once. And we don't want to unduly impact housing costs. If you have any insight, not just Harold, but anyone who has such insight to share into what affordable housing typically looks like in the Yuma area, if those types of small single-family homes constructed individually that I was describing tend to fit that bill, great. But if there are other types of low-income housing or other affordable housing that are more common in the Yuma area, and you can describe some trends regarding how we might distinguish those from other types of construction in particular, we can take a look at what impact that would have on the attainment model to adjust the rule applicability to reflect certain types of carve-outs. But we would need to know very specifically what we're looking for. And again, it would need to be something which, if we were to carve it out of the attainment model, we would still be able to demonstrate attainment for the area. But we certainly don't want to cause undue burden for residential costs. Another hand went up. George?
Yes, thank you. Within this draft rule, I don't see a section for enforcement. What does that look like? Failure to comply.
So, yeah, we don't generally include provisions related to enforcement in our rules. We have general enforcement authority under statute that applies to all of our rules. And so the legal authority we have, and again, this emphasize that this is just our authority, not what we do as a matter of course. But we have authority to, first of all, issue an administrative order requiring compliance. We do not have the authority to assess fines administratively. So if we want to assess a monetary penalty against someone who's violating a rule, that would include this one if it goes into effect, then we have to go to court and apply for that. And the Attorney General has to bring an action on our behalf in Superior Court. We also have the authority to seek an injunction in court against somebody who is in violation of the rules. There's also a limited amount of criminal liability for violations of air quality requirements, but I don't think anything in that particular statute would be likely to apply in this case. And I can't, the last criminal air quality case I'm familiar with occurred when I first started working for the state over 20 years ago. So that, that is something I would not be concerned about. So, and in general, that's our legal authority. What we try to do is we try to emphasize, compliance assistance and getting people to come back into compliance voluntarily, and to use the more coercive measures like seeking penalties or issuing orders or getting an injunction, where it's more of at least a serious case, or multiple violations, something like that. So generally, what we would do is, if it's a relatively minor violation, we'll issue something called a Notice of Opportunity to Comply, or NOC. If it's a little more serious, we'll issue something called a Notice of Violation. and that will identify what violations have occurred, give you a time period to come back into compliance and to demonstrate compliance to us. And in most cases, if you voluntarily, respond to that and voluntarily come back into compliance, there wouldn't be additional measures taken by the department.
Kelsey, did you have something to add regarding enforcement?
Not regarding enforcement, it's a different topic.
Okay, before we dive into that, Randy, was your comment about or a question about this or something else?
No, it was about this. Thank you. Randy Chris with the city of Yuma. I'm wondering what the city and counties, I mean, I know George, is a liaison between you and our community, but from the city of Yuma jurisdictions, what obligation do we have? I mean, we're not tasked with enforcing this, right?
No,
That
you're
was
not.
concerning to me with our staff hanging on a threshold anyways, with as busy as we are down here. So like for an example, when a construction, we do a pre-con on almost every large commercial project, almost all projects now. We're just going to remind them that to have their dust control form filled out, but if they don't have it filled out, we're not stopping that work, correct? That would be you guys if that ever happened, or I guess I just don't want to
No,
be
you
put in the
don't.
position, of enforcing ADEQ's rules.
Well, you won't be. It would be helpful if you could notify us when you become aware of a violation, but
Okay.
there's no obligation to, send a Yuma police officer out to the site or anything.
Okay, thank you for that.
Sure.
I don't see anything else, so Kelsey, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, my name's Kelsey. Again, I'm air quality inspector here with ADEQ. Perhaps this is a discussion for a different day, but I was wondering if any of the PM10 regulations here are expected to apply to our rock products, concrete, rock crushing, screening, hot mix asphalt.
No, we don't have any rules that would apply to those types of operations in the plan.
Okay, thank you.
We are just, but we have, probably, I'm not sure to what extent they're even significant. They're not really significant contributors in Yuma, right, Adam?
Twice. So in the initial model, we had left out portable sources of a particular type that held rock product air general permits. I appreciate the feedback that we received at last May's workshop in that regard. But even after taking those air general permit holders into account, it appears, at least at the Yuma super site, can't speak for other locations where we don't have data throughout the non-attainment area, but at the monitoring site, we determined based on our model that those sources were insignificant contributors to any of the exceedances that we looked at.
Okay. No, I appreciate the insight. Thank you, Adam.
And of course, whatever requirements apply in their permits, and this applies also to individual permit holders, we're still banking on those requirements. So we're, in order to make sure that we attain the standards in a timely fashion, we need to make sure that folks comply with their existing permits, in particular that they remain below their permitted potentials to emit PM10. But no novel requirements at this time would be needed.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any more hands raised. Or questions. So I think we can call this meeting adjourned. Thank you all for your attendance. We look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks at our second meeting. And again, we really appreciate the feedback that we got at this meeting. I think you've given us several important points to consider, for example, with regard to the wind barriers. And we will definitely start taking a look at that right away. We're looking for comments, written comments by October 31st. If you can manage that, if that turns out to be a problem, that's something we can discuss at the next stakeholder meeting. But again, we really welcome your feedback and look forward to getting to the point where we have a working rule for Yuma that gets us out of this pickle. So thank you all. Bye-bye.